Welcome to the deep dive. So picture this. It's August 1945.
Right. A really pivotal moment.
Europe's kind of picking up the pieces after years of devastating war, but over in the Pacific.
Yeah, the fight against Japan is still dragging on, just incredibly brutal, still going.
And right in the middle of it all, there's this one man facing just an unbelievable decision. The weight of the world, really.
It's a decision, yeah. Whether to unleash this terrifying new power, this weapon that humanity had cooked up.
Exactly. It's the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
And that's the moment, isn't it?
Oh.
That's Harry S. Truman for most people. He gets boiled down to the man who dropped the bomb.
It's true. And look, that decision is absolutely central to understanding him. You can't ignore it. But focusing only on that, it misses so much of the bigger picture.
Right.
As we've been digging into the source material for this deep dive, this really detailed documentary transcript that follows his whole life, birth through post-presidency, what just jumps out is how unconventional his journey to that moment actually was.
Absolutely. And that's our mission today, using this transcript as our roadmap. We want to go beyond just the presidency, beyond those huge, famous decisions, and try to understand the man.
Yeah, the person behind the title.
How did this, pretty unassuming guy from rural Missouri end up navigating this incredibly winding path, full of struggles, setbacks, these unexpected turns?
That somehow land him in the Oval Office, right smack in the middle of one of the most critical, chaotic periods in history.
So we're going to pull out the key insights from this source. The moments that shaped him, the people who influenced him, the challenges he overcame, and what this transcript reveals about his character.
And importantly, how that character was formed long before he was making those world-altering decisions. It didn't just appear overnight.
Think of this as your shortcut to getting a genuine feel for Harry Truman. We're looking for those aha moments where you can suddenly see the connection, right? Tracing his later choices, his legacy, back to those early days.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where does the source start us off?
Right at the beginning, his origins, which, as the source emphasizes, were very different from your typical presidential background.
Very different. We start May 8th, 1884, Lamar, Missouri. A small village, really quite removed from the power centers of the East Coast.
And his family roots sound pretty deeply embedded in that Missouri sort of frontier experience.
Oh, definitely. His dad's father, Anderson Ship Truman, he came over from Kentucky by horseback back in 1846. Harry's father, John Anderson Truman, was mostly a farmer and an animal trader.
The source describes him as an aggressive businessman. That's interesting.
It is, yeah. But apparently quite docile at home. Liked to sing while his wife played the piano. A bit of a contrast there.
And his mother's side, Martha Ellen Young.
Right. She married John in 1881. Her family, the Youngs, had been in Missouri longer, since 1841. And her father, Solomon Young, was pretty successful, accumulated thousands of acres.
Okay, and this is where that Civil War shadow comes in. Missouri was complicated, a slave state, but it didn't cede. How did the war affect the Young family?
Profoundly, according to the source. And it left a lasting mark, especially on Martha. Their farm was raided by Union troops, several times between 61 and 63.
Wow.
And Martha, she was just a little girl, less than mine for the first raid, but she carried this deep, lifelong resentment specifically towards East Coast Northerners because of it.
That's a powerful detail. That kind of ingrained feeling must have shaped her worldview, maybe Harry's too, indirectly. What about her education? Sounds like it was a bit unusual for the time and place.
It was, yeah. She went to Lexington Baptist Female College for a couple of years, studied music, art. The source paints her as, outspoken and not really inclined towards farm life or housework, even after she got married.
So Harry's born into this mix. Deep Missouri roots, Civil War memories, this enterprising father, and an educated, strong-willed mother. And we have to ask about the middle name, the S. It's famous.
It is. And the source backs up the story everyone knows. They had a stillborn child first, then Harry was born in 84, named after his mom's brother, Harrison. But for the middle name.
They couldn't agree.
Couldn't agree. Ship after his dad's father, or Solomon after his mom's father. So they just punted and went with S. Stands for absolutely nothing.
A small thing, but it kind of hints at that blend of family lines, maybe a bit of parental compromise right from day one.
Exactly. So moving into his childhood, sounds like stability wasn't exactly the theme early on.
No, not really. John Truman, his dad, seemed to struggle financially. They moved around a lot. In 1887, they ended up on the big Young family farm near Grandview. John managed part of it, helped his father-in-law with another chunk.
Were there siblings around during this time?
Yes, he had a younger brother, John Vivian, they called him Vivian, born in 86, and then a sister, Mary Jane, born in 89. She became his closest friend growing up, the source says.
So farm life, did he enjoy it?
He seems to have had fond memories, yeah. running around with his brother, playing chess and cards with his Uncle Harrison, though there was one scary moment, swallowed a peach stone when he was 4. Nearly died.
Yikes. Close call. A mix of the idyllic and the dangerous, like farm life often is.
And then comes this discovery, something that really changed the course of his childhood activities.
His eyesight, yeah. It was 4th of July, 1889. The family noticed he was all excited by the sounds of the fireworks.
Not the sights.
Exactly. Didn't seem interested in watching them. His mom got worried, thought maybe he was going blind, took him to an eye doctor in Kansas City.
And the diagnosis, flat eyeballs.
That's what the source says. Flat eyeballs. Meant he needed these really thick, heavy glasses.
Which must have limited him quite a bit physically.
Hugely. Those glasses were expensive and fragile, so forget playing baseball or roughhousing much. Too risky. And the source really emphasizes how this probably pushed him towards other things.
Like books and music.
Precisely. His mother was determined he'd get a good education. So in 1890, they moved again, this time, to Independence. Best public schools around, apparently.
Independence. That was a big deal historically, right?
Yeah.
Starting point for the westward trails.
Yeah, Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail. By the 1890s, it had recovered from the Civil War, but was kind of overshadowed by nearby Kansas City. Anyway, Harry starts school there in 92.
And because of the glasses limiting play?
Right, he had chores, worked part-time at a drugstore, and he really dove into the piano, which he got from his mother's side, practiced at least 2 hours every single day.
That dedication. That's a recurring theme, isn't it? He also had a serious illness around then.
He did. Diphtheria, January 1894. He and his brother Vivian both got it. Recovery was slow, but the source notes he was determined, caught up fast when he got back to school. So fast, they let him skip 3rd grade.
Wow. So he was bright academically.
Seems so. Did well, especially in math and humanities. And this is where the reading habit really cemented itself.
What was he reading?
He basically lived in the public library, just devoured books, especially about history and famous leaders. Military figures were a big focus. Napoleon, Hannibal. He apparently dreamed of being a great general himself.
That military interest started young then.
Very young. It even popped up during the Spanish-American War in 98. He was 14, and he and his buddies formed their own little mock soldier company.
Huh. So the seeds were there. What about politics? His dad was involved.
His father was a Democrat, yeah. And Harry actually worked as a page at the 1900 Democratic National Convention in Kansas City, saw William Jennings Bryan get nominated. But the source is clear. Harry himself had very little personal interest in politics back then. It wasn't a driving ambition like the military or just reading everything he could get his hands on.
That's fascinating. A future president, but politics wasn't really on his radar as a kid.
Yeah.
But looking back at these early years, the money struggles, the moving, the farm, the health stuff, limiting sports but pushing him to books and piano, his mom's influence, not having much money, how does the source say this shaped him, made him different?
The source really hammers this point. His background was so different from most presidents of that time. No wealthy family, no Ivy League education, no early career path laid out in law or big business.
He was grounded in a different reality.
Exactly. He understood hardship. He understood small town, rural America because he lived it. Those challenges, the glasses, the illnesses, the financial insecurity they built, resilience, determination, and that love of history. It gave him heroes, models for leadership, a whole framework he'd draw on later, maybe without even realizing it sometimes.
It paints a picture of someone shaped by practical realities and intellectual curiosity, not privilege. Why is that foundation so crucial to grasp?
Because it really informs everything else. It helps explain his later pragmatism, his empathy for ordinary people, his whole approach. The source suggests this unique, sometimes difficult path created a leader fundamentally different from the Washington establishment. Understanding that difference is key to understanding his presidency.
Okay, so school finishes. He has these military dreams, but his eyesight's still an issue, and money's tight. What's next?
Well, the regular army was still out because of the eyes. University wasn't really an option financially, so he went to a commercial college in Kansas City for a bit, bookkeeping, typewriting, practical skills.
Even that didn't last.
Nope. 1902, his father lost a lot of money speculating on grain futures. Another financial hit.
Seems like a pattern.
It does. So Harry had to quit school and work. He bounced around mailroom at the Kansas City Star for a bit, then maybe 6 months as a timekeeper for a railroad construction crew. Then, in 1903, he moves back to Kansas City and gets a job at the National Commerce Bank.
Okay, a bank clerk. That sounds a bit more stable, maybe. A chance to learn something solid.
It seems like it was. The source says he was seen as talented, diligent. He even moved to a rival bank, Union National, after a couple of years. This period was important. He's learning about finance, economics, how the city works.
And Kansas City wasn't just about work for him, right? You got to taste the culture, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He was really drawn to it. There's this amazing story in the source from 1905. He goes to see the famous pianist Pendergast play. Huge concert. Afterwards, his piano teacher actually takes him backstage to meet the maestro.
No way.
Yeah. And Truman mentions he's struggling with a specific bit in Paderewski's Minuet in G. So Paderewski sits down at the piano and gives him like a 15-minute personal lesson right there.
That's incredible. For a young bank clerk, it shows that artistic side was still very much alive.
Absolutely adds another layer to him. He also went to the Met Opera when they came through town, though the source says he found Grand Opera a bit too intense. Preferred theater, lighter stuff. And around the same time, 1905, maybe chasing that old military dream again, he joins the Missouri National Guard, age 21.
Even with the eyesight.
The Guard's standards were a bit looser, but here's another anecdote that just screams history. He puts on his new Blue Guard uniform, goes out to the family farm, all proud.
Oh.
And his grandmother, Martha's mother, takes one look and basically says, "That's the first time a blue uniform's been in this house since 1863. Don't bring it here again."
Wow. Those Civil War feelings ran deep, just below the surface.
Deep. So he's sampling city life, finance, culture, a bit of military service. But this phase ends abruptly, too. 1906. His parents' crops failed. Badly. He felt obliged to go back to the young farm near Grandview and help out. The original big house had burned down years before, so he moved into a smaller one his grandmother had built. And he basically stays there for the next 11 years.
11 years. Back on the farm after getting a taste of other things?
Yep, working alongside his father mostly, until his dad died in 1914. Back to the land, full-time.
Was he resigned to it, or did he try to make a go of it?
Oh, he threw himself into it, eager to make it work, improve things. He read everything he could on new farming techniques, technology, got obsessed with fighting weeds, practiced crop rotation, got a better horse-drawn plow instead of the old walking one, worked brutal hours, 12 hours a day, even more during harvest.
Sounds exhausting. Were there specific struggles with the farming itself?
The source mentions the animals were a constant headache. They had a big herd of cows for the KC market, but Harry found them difficult, hated milking them. There's a funny story about him and his dad chasing one cow for half an hour, only for his dad to decide not to sell it anyway. He even got attacked by a cow once, broke his leg in 1913.
Ouch.
And then there was disease. Hog cholera wiped out a bunch of their pigs in 1912. He had the lovely job of vaccinating the ones that survived.
These details really bring home the sheer physical grind and uncertainty of it. And like you said, spending your 20s doing this.
Yeah.
So unusual for a future president.
Completely unusual. While his contemporaries were maybe in law school or climbing corporate ladders, Truman was wrestling with cows and cholera. The source really implies this period cemented that practical, tough, no-nonsense side of him.
Was he still trying other things on the side to, make some money?
Yep.
Improve his prospects?
He was. Always looking for an angle. From about 1910 onwards, he was entering lotteries for land grants out west, South Dakota, Montana, tried different schemes with his Uncle Harrison. He put money into a zinc mine in Oklahoma in 1914 that didn't pay off. Then in 1916, he invested $5,000 in an oil drilling project in Kansas, even served as treasurer for the company.
Did the oil thing work out? Please tell me something worked out.
Afraid not. They drilled down 900 feet, but then WWI started, manpower dried up, and they had to shut it down. And here's the kicker, the real painful irony the source points out. Later on, another company drilled in the exact same spot and struck oil. Big time.
Oh, come on. That's rough.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So he's hitting his mid-30s, tried all these ventures, and still hadn't really made it financially. Luck just wasn't breaking his way.
And during this whole farming side hustle period, there was the romance with Bess Wallace going on, complicated by his finances.
Exactly. Bess Wallace. He had known her since school, but she came from a slightly higher social circle in Independence. It was hard for him to really court her seriously until around 1910. The source gives us that sweet story about the cake plate.
Right. The excuse to visit.
Yeah. December 1910. Her mom sent over a cake. He used returning the empty plate as his chance, and Bess invited him in. After that, they started seeing each other pretty regularly on weekends.
But when he proposed, she initially turned him down.
The source says she refused graciously. Basically, her mother wasn't keen on her marrying someone with, uncertain prospects and not much money, which you can imagine probably just spurred Harry on even more to try and strike it rich with those other ventures.
So mid-30s, farm struggles, business failures, stalled romance. It feels like he's kind of stuck. And then World War I changes everything.
It really does. An unexpected door opens. America joins the war in April 1917. And crucially for Harry, the Army loosened its eyesight restrictions for recruitment. Finally, his chance to serve properly.
He'd been in the Guard, but this was the real deal.
Right. He'd helped reorganize some Guard batteries earlier, and now he was made a first lieutenant in the 129th Field Artillery Regiment.
How did he adapt to actual military leadership?
He trained down at Camp Doniphan in Oklahoma. And the source highlights something interesting. Early on, he and another officer successfully ran the regimental canteen. Really went out of their way to get supplies for the men, showed initiative, concern for his guys.
When did they head to France?
Spring of 1918 arrived right in the middle of a major German offensive, but General Pershing, the American commander, insisted on more training before sending troops into heavy combat. So they trained for about 3 months. Harry became captain of Battery D in July 1918.
And combat. How did Captain Truman perform?
The source suggests he was effective. Disciplined his men, drilled them hard, earned their respect. They saw their first action in the Vosges Mountains. Later, at the Battle of St. Mihiel, they were there but didn't actually engage. But then came the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He meticulously marched his battery under cover of darkness for over 20 nights straight to get them into position.
That sounds incredibly demanding.
And it does, and there's a really telling incident from that time. He spotted an enemy artillery battery and, on his own initiative, ordered his guns to open fire, taking it out. His commanding officer, Colonel Clem, was furious, threatened him with a court-martial for firing into another unit's assigned sector.
How did Truman react?
According to the source, Truman basically stood his ground. Confident he'd done the right thing, he challenged Clem to go ahead with the court-martial. Clem backed down. No action was taken.
It's a huge moment. Shows that decisiveness under pressure, that willingness to take responsibility, even challenging authority.
Absolutely. You see the seeds of the future president there, maybe.
Yeah.
Making the tough call and owning it.
Yeah.
After the Meuse-Argonne, his unit was rotated out, spent a few weeks near Verdun, and then the war ended, November 11th, 1918. Armistice.
So fighting over. Time to relax.
A bit. Troops had downtime. Truman got to see Paris, traveled down to the Mediterranean coast, Marseille, Nice, Monaco. But getting home took ages. There was a shortage of ships, so they were stuck in France for months. He had to keep his men busy, keep order.
But he was itching to get back.
Desperate. Mostly to get back to Bess.
Hmm.
She'd finally agreed to marry him before he shipped out. His letters home, the source says, were all about that. Didn't care what Wilson was negotiating in Paris, just wanted to get home to Missouri.
When did they finally make it back?
Battery D sailed in April 1919, landed in New York on the 20th, big parade back in Kansas City. The unit was officially demobilized May 6th.
It wasn't a super long period of service, but it seems like it had a massive impact on him personally.
Huge. The source mentions his biographer, Ada Donald, argued Truman himself considered his WWI service his most important contribution to the country, even more than being president.
Wow.
That's what Donald argued. And he formed incredibly strong bonds with the men he served with. They clearly respected him. They gave him this engraved cup. Captain Harry S. Truman, presented by the members of Battery D in appreciation of his justice, ability, and leadership. That says a lot.
It really does. And the wedding finally happened.
Yes. June 28, 1919, he and Bess Wallace got married in Independence. They were both in their mid-30s by then, which was a little older than usual. They moved into the house owned by Bess's grandmother, where Bess and her mother were already living. And they stayed married for 53 years.
Okay, so he's back. He's a decorated war hero. He's married. Surely now things start looking up financially. Maybe this haberdashery.
Well, he gave it a shot. Just a month before the wedding, May 1919, he and his army buddy, Eddie Jacobson, opened that men's clothing store in Kansas City. Truman put up most of the money, sold his share of the family farm, his equipment, put everything he had into it, basically.
Building on that wartime connection.
Exactly. Their old buddies from the 129th were their main customers at first. It was in a good part of town. The economy was booming right after the war. And initially, the store did really well. Business was great.
He stayed involved with veterans groups, too.
Oh, yeah. Kept his officer's commission in the Army Reserve, helped get the Reserve Officers Association going in Kansas City, which eventually became a national thing. And he played a big part in organizing the first National American Legion Convention, held in KC in 1921. That was a huge success, brought in big names like General Pershing.
Sounds like he was finally finding his footing, making connections, business doing well. But that post-war boom didn't last, did it?
It didn't. 1921, the economy just crashed.
Yeah.
European turmoil hit exports, prices plummeted, and it absolutely hammered their store, all that inventory they'd bought. suddenly worth next to nothing. They had maybe $30,000 worth of stock that became almost worthless overnight. Yeah, they had to close the store in April 1922, struggled to pay back a bank loan. Jacobson eventually declared bankruptcy in 25. Truman managed to avoid it because by then he'd actually been elected to public office.
Another failed business. He's approaching 40. Farmer, banker, miner, oil guy, haberdasher. None of it stuck. It's just such an unconventional resume for a future president.
It really highlights how much he struggled financially and professionally for decades. And this failure, this low point, is actually the moment that pivots him toward politics. Summer of 1921, the store's failing and he gets a visit.
Who?
Jim Pendergast, another veteran from the 129th, and Jim's father, Michael Pendergast.
Ah, the Pendergasts. The Kansas City political machine.
The very same. Michael ran the Democratic machine in Jackson County for his brother, Tom Pendergast, who basically controlled Kansas City politics. They were looking for a candidate for the eastern part of Jackson County for the 1922 election, someone to beat their rivals in another Democratic faction.
Why Truman? He had zero political experience besides being a page decades earlier.
That was part of the appeal, according to the source. He seemed independent, not initially tied to the Pendergast machine. Plus, his farming background and his war record, those were seen as real assets, things that would appeal to voters.
So they recruited him. How did the campaign go?
Well, he didn't publicly align too closely with the Pendergasts right away. They endorsed him late in the primary. And apparently he wasn't exactly a barnstorming speaker. The source even says some supporters literally fell asleep during his speeches.
Ouch. Not exactly inspiring stuff.
Yeah.
But he won the primary.
Just barely. Election night was chaos. He was ahead by fewer than 80 votes. His team actually had to physically stop the rival faction from stuffing ballot boxes at the last minute.
Wow, politics was rough and tumble.
Definitely wasn't Jackson County then. The general election against the Republican was easier, though. It was a solidly Democratic area.
So, almost by accident, his political career is launched, thanks to a war buddy and the needs of a political machine. What was it like being part of that system?
His first term, 1923 to 25, was a crash course in what the source calls the Machiavellian world of machine politics. He learned the ropes fast, how deals were cut, how factions fought. He worked with another Pendergast loyalist to outmaneuver the presiding judge, who was from a rival faction, and then they went after corruption.
He investigated corruption while being part of the machine.
Yeah, specifically targeting a guy named Miles Bolger from the rival Shannon faction. Bolger had overseen the building of a county orphanage. The cost was outrageous, $165,000 for just 60 kids. And get this, there was a bronze plaque with Bolger's name at the entrance that cost over $1,000 itself.
That's pretty blatant.
Right. Truman pushed for an investigation. They found ridiculously lavish interiors, marble, expensive wood paneling. An audit showed the county debt had skyrocketed under Bolger. Truman exposed all this.
And got reelected easily.
Nope. He actually failed to get reelected in 1924 despite bringing all that stuff to light.
Another setback. What did he do then?
Back to odd jobs for a couple of years, trying to support the family. His daughter, Mary Margaret, was born in February 24, so the pressure was on. But he didn't stay out of office long. By January 1927, he was back, this time elected as presiding judge of the Jackson County Court, a more powerful position.
And this time, working directly with the big boss, Tom Pendergast.
Yes, much more closely. Part of the job involved giving out government jobs to supporters, patronage promised by the machine. He played that game. But, and this is really crucial, according to the source, while he worked within the Pendergast system, he also maintained a degree of independence in his official duties. He built a reputation for honesty, for fair dealing.
How did he manage that tightrope walk?
The source suggests he actively tried to eliminate corruption as much as possible. He recognized privately that, in that system, people expected their small slice to make things happen. But the source is emphatic. Truman himself did not take a penny. He benefited from the machine's power, but he didn't personally profit from corruption.
That's a really important distinction the source makes. So he used the machine's clout for what?
Yeah.
What did he actually achieve as presiding judge?
He was there for 8 years, 27 to 35, and he launched a really ambitious program of building infrastructure, roads mostly, added over 300 miles to the county road network. And significantly, he implemented a secret bidding process for the contracts specifically to try and limit the graft and corruption. He also oversaw remodeling the courthouse in Independence and building a brand new modern Art Deco courthouse in Kansas City. So he used the machine's political power to get tangible things done for the county while apparently keeping his own hands clean financially.
So despite the Pendergast Association, he was building a record as an effective, relatively honest administrator. How did this local experience prepare him for Washington?
It was invaluable. It taught him the nitty-gritty of politics, the compromises, the power plays, how to build coalitions, how to manage large projects. Surviving, even thriving within that Pendergast system, while maintaining his personal reputation for financial integrity. That shows real political skill, pragmatism, combined with certain ethical lines he wouldn't cross. It was a tough, practical education.
After nearly a decade as presiding judge, he started looking higher.
He did. January 1934, he goes to Tom Pendergast and says he wants to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. But Pendergast surprised him, suggested he run for the U.S. Senate instead.
Straight to the Senate. That was unusual. Did Truman think Pendergast was trying to get rid of him?
That was his first thought, yeah. Usually you'd go to the House first. But the source suggests Pendergast had his own reasons. By 34, Pendergast basically controlled Missouri politics. He wanted a reliable senator in Washington to counterbalance the state's other senator, Bennett Clark, whose family was powerful in St. Louis politics.
So Pendergast needed a loyalist. Was Truman his first choice?
Apparently not. The source says Pendergast offered the Senate nomination to 4 or 5 other people before even considering Truman. Truman just didn't have much name recognition outside of Jackson County. It actually took some persuading from other Pendergast guys, James Aylward, Jim Pendergast, to convince Tom that the machine had enough votes to pull it off. They finally talked Truman into running in May 1934.
Another reluctant step up, almost pushed into it again. How did that Senate campaign go in 34?
It was tough. He crisscrossed the state, county by county. He had serious rivals in the Democratic primary, guys backed by Clark and the St. Louis machine. Policy-wise, they were all pretty similar. Everyone supported FDR's New Deal. So Truman leaned on his strengths, his war record, his farming background. That played well in the rural areas.
And the Pendergast machine delivered in Kansas City.
Absolutely crucial. That's what put him over the top. He won the Democratic primary by about 40,000 votes. After that, the general election in November against the Republican was much easier. Missouri was strongly Democratic then.
So, January 1935, he arrives in Washington. Still wearing that Senator from Pendergast label, presumably. What was his reception like?
Pretty chilly, the source notes. Yes, that nickname stuck. Fellow Democrats were wary. He admired FDR enormously, but getting a meeting took him 5 months just to get 15 minutes with the president. He kept a low profile initially, spoke very rarely on the Senate floor for the first couple of years, didn't give his first major speech until 1937.
But he stayed loyal to Roosevelt politically.
Very loyal. Unlike Senator Clark, who often voted against New Deal programs, Truman consistently supported FDR's agenda. He'd hoped to get on the Military Affairs Committee, that old interest, but ended up on interstate commerce instead.
Which, surprisingly, turned out to be a good fit because of his background.
Exactly. All that road-building experience in Jackson County, suddenly very relevant. The committee handled railroads, shipping, even the new growing field of aviation. He got onto an aviation subcommittee, helped draft a bill creating the Civil Aeronautics Board.
And he also got involved in regulating the railroads.
Yes, that became a major focus. His work on aviation fed into a big transportation bill he worked on with a friend, Senator Burton Wheeler from Montana. They were trying to balance the interests of railroads versus barges and river transport. Both Truman and Wheeler came from farming states where railroads were often seen as the bad guys, charging high rates.
So they went after the railroads.
They held hearings in 1937 called Executives on the Carpet, pointed out how railroads were paying out big dividends while cutting jobs and letting tracks and equipment fall apart. But they were careful, the source notes, not to just blindly favor the barge industry either. The goal was fair competition. Their bill, the Wheeler Transportation Act, finally passed in September 1940. It brought the water carriers under the oversight of the Interstate Commerce Commission, too.
Okay, so he's finding his legislative footing. But then comes 1940, and his re-election is threatened by the collapse of the Pendergast machine back home.
Yeah, huge political crisis for him. Tom Pendergast was sick, had developed a massive gambling problem, losing hundreds of thousands, needed bigger and bigger bribes to cover his debts. Things got really out of hand in the 1936 governor's race. Pendergast engaged in what the source calls outrageous vote rigging for his candidate, Lloyd Stark. Literally produced more votes than there were registered voters in some places.
That's brazen.
Incredibly. But then Stark, once he became governor, turned on Pendergast, and President Roosevelt actually backed Stark's efforts to dismantle the machine.
Where did this leave Truman? How did he react when the full extent of Pendergast's corruption came out?
The source suggests Truman was genuinely unaware of just how deep the corruption went. He'd even defended Pendergast on the Senate floor earlier. He was reportedly astonished when the indictments came down in April 1939. Pendergast nailed for taking a $750,000 bribe from insurance companies. Pendergast went to prison. the machine crumbled.
And Truman's up for re-election in 1940, suddenly without his political base and with FDR supporting his opponent.
Exactly. Governor Stark decided to run against Truman for the Senate seat, and FDR supported Stark. Roosevelt even tried to ease Truman out, offering him a lifetime appointment on the Interstate Commerce Commission, a safe landing spot.
But Truman refused.
Defiantly refused, according to the source. He wasn't going to quit. He decided to fight. It looked like an impossible race against the sitting governor who had FDR's blessing. But Truman's team made a clever move. They encouraged the prosecutor who actually brought down Pendergast, Maurice Milligan, to also enter the primary.
Splitting the anti-Pendergast vote.
Exactly. It split the vote that would have gone against Truman. Then, in a twist, Truman got some crucial last-minute support from his Senate colleague, Bennett Clark, the guy Pendergast originally wanted Truman to counter. Clark helped deliver votes from St. Louis, and Truman squeaked through the Democratic primary. Then he won the general election in November 1940.
That's an incredible survival story. He leverages the machine, gets labeled by it, seems genuinely surprised by its depths of corruption, watches it collapse, defies the president, and still wins re-election. What does that tell you about him?
It just underscores his toughness, his resilience, his political instincts, and again, that source detail about him not taking money personally, even within that system, seems crucial to how he navigated it and survived its downfall when Pendergast himself didn't. Refusing FDR's offer, fighting Stark that shows a real independent streak, a willingness to gamble everything on himself. That 1940 race must have been a forge.
While all this political drama is unfolding, the world stage is darkening. World War II is underway in Europe. How did that affect his Senate role?
Well, after France fell in 1940, the U.S. started massively rearming. FDR won his third term, partly because of the global crisis. Truman, representing Missouri, was glad to see defense contracts coming to the state, but he quickly became concerned about waste and potential corruption in how all that money was being spent. He started doing his own inspection tours of army bases and factories.
What did he find?
He found contracts structured in ways that actually incentivized higher costs. He saw small businesses getting shut out of bidding. He wasn't afraid to lock horns with powerful people, like the Secretary of the Navy, over production rates. He became a frequent critic of the War Production Board after it was set up following Pearl Harbor.
So he carved out a role as a watchdog over defense spending.
Yeah, essentially. His committee, which became known as the Truman Committee, investigated waste and inefficiency in the war effort. It saved the government millions, maybe billions, and made him nationally known for the first time. It also showed his administrative skills and his commitment to, government working properly, even under pressure.
Did this create friction with Roosevelt?
He complained about federal agencies, but the source says he stayed on cordial terms with FDR himself. And then comes 1944. The war is still raging, and FDR is planning to run for an unprecedented fourth term, but his health is obviously failing.
Right. And this is where Truman's path takes another completely unexpected turn. Senior Democratic Party leaders were convinced FDR wouldn't live through a fourth term. They were really worried about Vice President Henry Wallace, who they thought was too liberal, too eccentric, taking over.
So they wanted Wallace off the ticket.
Desperately. They managed to persuade Roosevelt to drop Wallace sometime in early 1944, but FDR didn't immediately pick a replacement.
How did Truman's name even come up? He wasn't exactly a party power broker. It was partly Robert Hennigan, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Hennigan was from St. Louis and had helped Truman in that tough 1940 race. He was one of the key figures who pushed Roosevelt to accept Truman as the running mate in July 1944, just before the convention. But even then, FDR was cagey about it. He didn't publicly endorse Truman. At least two other guys, including Wallace, went into the convention thinking they were FDR's choice.
So it was messy. And Truman himself wasn't eager for the job.
Not at all. When he first heard his name being mentioned earlier in the year, he told a friend basically, "Tell them I don't want it." And the source adds this really humanizing detail. He was worried. Worried the press might find out he'd been paying his wife, Bess, a salary from his Senate office fund since 1941.
Why was he doing that?
Just to help make ends meet, support the family finances. It wasn't illegal, but he feared how it might look, the potential scandal. Imagine that being considered for VP, but worrying about how you paid your wife a modest salary.
It really grounds him. So how did he end up accepting?
He wasn't officially told he was the guy until July 19th, right at the convention in Chicago. He still hesitated, but then FDR basically forced his hand. Roosevelt called a meeting of the party bosses and said, according to the source, "Well, you tell him if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's his responsibility."
That's some serious pressure. An ultimatum, basically.
Completely. Faced with that, Truman reluctantly agreed. He accepted the nomination.
Did he realize just how sick FDR was? Did Roosevelt tell him?
They had lunch at the White House about a month later, August 18th, and FDR was apparently quite blunt. The source quotes Roosevelt saying, "Harry, I'm not a well man and we cannot be sure of my future." A pretty direct warning. Truman campaigned mostly by train, following FDR's advice not to fly. Roosevelt won easily in November, and Harry Truman became vice president on January 20th, 1945.
The vice presidency back then. It wasn't the power center it can be today.
Yeah. No, historically it was pretty weak. Mostly ceremonial duties, presiding over the Senate. But the source makes the point. Given what FDR had told him about his health, Truman knew he had to be ready. He recognized he could be president at any moment.
And that moment came much sooner than anyone expected.
Tragically soon. Less than 3 months into the term, afternoon of April 12, 1945, Truman gets an urgent call. Come to the White House, quick, use the side entrance. He arrives, and Eleanor Roosevelt meets him. She puts her hand on his shoulder and tells him, "Harry, the president is dead."
Just like that. Thrown into the deep end.
Instantly. Chief Justice Harlan Stone, cabinet members, they were all summoned hastily. Harry S. Truman was sworn in as president just after 7 o'clock that evening.
Incredible. He's suddenly leading the country in the final stages of a world war, inheriting all these immense challenges with almost no transition.
Exactly. He was nearly 61, but much healthier than FDR had been. The government was huge, sprawling after the New Deal and the war, but Roosevelt had run it very personally, didn't delegate much. Truman had to figure it all out fast. He started reorganizing quickly, replaced 6 cabinet secretaries in his first 3 months, brought in his own people. His closest advisor was his press secretary, Charlie Ross, an old friend from school.
He also made that interesting move reaching out to Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, a sign of his pragmatism. Weeks after taking office, asked Hoover, the Republican he'd replaced, to survey global food supplies. Later, asked him to chair a commission on government organization. Hoover actually recommended strengthening cabinet departments, which wasn't the typical Republican line. Truman listened.
So he takes office, war in Europe is wrapping up. Germany surrenders May 8th, but the Pacific War.
Still grinding on, Japan seemed determined to fight to the last man, even though defeat was inevitable. Truman's immediate focus had to be ending that war. He's also dealing with the emerging tensions with the Soviets, who were already tightening their grip on Eastern Europe.
He met Stalin for the first time at the Potsdam Conference in July 45.
Right. Him, Stalin, and Churchill, though Churchill got replaced by Clement Attlee mid-conference after losing the British election. The source describes the talks as tense, disagreements over Poland, Eastern Europe. Truman found Stalin difficult, much harder to deal with than Roosevelt apparently had. There's that famous story where Truman mentions the Pope's view on something and Stalin just dismisses it, asking, how many divisions does the Pope have?
A clash of worldviews right there. The personal dynamic was different from FDR and Stalin.
Very different, the source suggests. Less warmth, more suspicion. And this is happening just as the biggest secret of the war is about to break. While Truman is at Potsdam, he gets the coded message.
The bomb test.
July 16th, 1945. Successful detonation at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Manhattan Project, running for years in secret, had delivered. The weapon worked. About a week later, Truman casually mentions to Stalin they have a new weapon of unusual destructive force.
At this point, was the bomb seen primarily as a way to avoid invading Japan?
That was the dominant thinking, yes. The alternative was Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. U.S. troops were still dying daily in the Pacific. The firebombing of Japanese cities was already causing immense civilian casualties, but Japan wasn't surrendering. Military planners were predicting horrific losses for an invasion, hundreds of thousands of American casualties, maybe over 1 million, and Japanese casualties would be many times higher.
An almost unimaginable butcher's bill.
Truly horrific prospect. So the source explains the calculation. Using the bomb seemed, on balance, the way to avoid that greater loss of life, even though they didn't know exactly how devastating the bomb would be. They issued the Potsdam Declaration surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan refused.
And then Hiroshima.
August 6, 1945. The first bomb is dropped. 3 days later, August 9th, the second bomb hits Nagasaki.
And right at the same time, the Soviets declare war on Japan.
Yes. August 8th, they declare war and invade Manchuria the next day, August 9th, same day as Nagasaki. It was a double shock to the Japanese leadership. The source concludes it was the combination of the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war that finally pushed Emperor Hirohito to surrender, which he announced less than a week later.
This decision, using the bombs, remains the single most debated action of his presidency. How does the source handle that controversy?
It lays out the context of the invasion fears, the ongoing war, the firebombing. It presents the rationale about saving lives overall. But it doesn't just leave it there. It specifically raises a critical question, its own commentary, really. On balance, Truman's use of the first bomb against Hiroshima was possibly warranted, but he might have given the Japanese more time to respond before sanctioning the use of a second against Nagasaki just 3 days later.
That's very specific critique from the source itself, questioning the timing, the rush to use the second one.
Exactly. It highlights that point of contention, not just whether to use it, but the rapid escalation. It forces you, the reader, to grapple with the immense pressure, the uncertainty, and the horrific consequences of those few days in August 1945.
The war ends, but Truman's troubles are far from over. Post-war America is turbulent, and the Cold War begins almost immediately.
No rest for the wary president. Domestically, things went south fast. His approval rating, sky high at the war's end, crashed down to around 30% within a year. The press, which was hugely influential then, gave him a really hard time criticizing his appointments, his style.
What were the main domestic problems?
Huge challenges, bringing millions of soldiers home, transitioning this massive war economy back to peacetime. That was incredibly complicated. You had pent-up savings from wartime rationing, which threatened massive inflation, Congress under pressure from business and unions, weakened price controls, and prices shot up in '46. Then came the strikes.
Big ones, right?
Huge waves of strikes in 1946. Auto workers, steel workers, then the railroads, the coal miners. It paralyzed parts of the country. Truman had to get tough, especially with the miners, basically forcing them back to work.
And the political cost was high.
Very high. The Republicans hammered the Democrats on inflation, strikes, shortages. In the 1946 midterm elections, the Democrats got wiped out, lost control of both the House and the Senate. Truman was facing a hostile Congress just as the global situation was getting much, much colder.
The Iron Curtain speech.
Right. March 1946. Truman invites Winston Churchill, no longer prime minister but still a huge figure, to speak in Fulton, Missouri. And Churchill delivers that iconic line. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. A stark warning about Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, urging an Anglo-American alliance to counter it.
Was this aligning with thinking already happening in Truman's administration?
It seems so. Around the same time, George Kennan, a diplomat in Moscow, sent his famous long telegram. Kennan argued Soviet expansionism wasn't just about communism, it was rooted in centuries of Russian imperial ambition, that the Soviets would constantly probe for weaknesses.
So these ideas coalesce into a new strategy.
Yes. Truman and his advisors realized direct military confrontation with the Soviets everywhere wasn't feasible or desirable. Instead, they adopted the strategy of containment. Basically, stop the Soviets from expanding further, contain their influence where it already existed without starting World War III. This became official policy with the Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947. It guided U.S. foreign policy for the next 40 years.
How did they implement containment, practically speaking, especially in devastated Europe?
The key was economic reconstruction. The thinking was, if Western Europe recovered economically, people wouldn't turn to communism out of desperation. This led to the Marshall Plan. George Marshall, Truman's new Secretary of State, proposed this massive aid package, $13 billion, a staggering amount then. Officially, the European Recovery Program. It helped rebuild industries, create jobs, and crucially tied countries like Greece and Turkey, who were under pressure, firmly into the Western camp.
And containment faced its first major military test in Berlin.
A huge test. June 1948, Stalin tries to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin, which was an island within Soviet-controlled East Germany. He blockades all road, rail, and canal access.
Truman's response?
The Berlin airlift. A logistical miracle, really. For almost a year, American and British planes flew in everything the city needed: food, fuel, supplies. Round the clock, it was a massive undertaking, a clear signal of Western resolve. It worked. Stalin finally lifted the blockade in April 1949, and that same month, Truman presided over the creation of NATO.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yep. U.S., Canada, 10 Western European nations. A mutual defense pact aimed squarely at deterring Soviet aggression. The source calls it the most powerful military alliance ever assembled. So in Europe, containment led to these huge, lasting structures.
What about applying containment in Asia? That seems to have been more complicated.
Much more complicated. Initially, the U.S. backed the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese Civil War against Mao Zedong's communists. But the source is brutally honest about why that failed. It blames the extraordinary corruption and lack of character displayed by the nationalist leaders. Says most of the American aid was just stolen.
That's a damning assessment from the source.
It is. Truman eventually had to cut his losses, reduce support. The communists won in 1949. Chiang fled to Taiwan. So U.S. policy in Asia shifted. Focus became holding on to influence in the Philippines and rebuilding Japan as anti-communist bulwarks.
And the source mentioned a specific blind spot, or maybe reluctance, regarding Korea.
Yes. In the late 1940s, the assessment within the Truman administration, according to the source, was that South Korea would probably fall to the communist north eventually. And they seemed unwilling to commit the major resources, the military backing, needed to guarantee South Korea's survival. It wasn't seen as strategically vital compared to Japan.
A miscalculation that had huge consequences.
Devastating consequences. Because, as the source argues, this perception that the U.S. wouldn't defend South Korea directly encouraged the North Korean leader, Kim Il-sung, who had Soviet backing, to launch his invasion.
June 25th, 1950. North Korea invades the South in force. How did Truman react?
He was surprised by the scale and speed of it. He saw it not just as a local conflict, but as a direct challenge orchestrated by Stalin, maybe the first step in a global communist push. He also felt the credibility of the brand new United Nations was at stake. If the UN couldn't respond to blatant aggression, what was the point?
So he went to the UN.
Yes. And crucially, the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council at that moment, protesting that China's seat was still held by the nationalists on Taiwan, not Mao's government. So the Soviets couldn't veto the resolution. Truman got UN authorization for a military intervention, with the force placed under American command.
But the war started badly for the US and UN forces.
Very badly. By early August 1950, they'd been pushed all the way back to a small pocket around the port of Busan in the southeast corner of Korea. It looked like North Korea was about to win completely. The source says they were on the cusp of victory.
Then came MacArthur's gamble at Incheon.
The masterstroke. Mid-September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur, the UN commander, launches this incredibly risky amphibious landing way behind enemy lines at Incheon near Seoul. It worked brilliantly, caught the North Koreans totally by surprise, cut their supply lines, captured Seoul. Suddenly, the North Korean army was trapped.
A complete reversal of fortune.
Dramatic. MacArthur, buoyed by this success, gets Truman's approval to cross the 38th parallel and pursue the retreating North Koreans into their own territory in late September.
He seemed poised to unify all of Korea.
That became the goal. MacArthur was driving north, looked like he might overrun the whole peninsula. But this alarmed the new communist government in China. Mao Zedong feared MacArthur would push right up to or even cross the Yalu River border between North Korea and China.
China warned the US not to approach the border.
They sent warnings through diplomatic channels. MacArthur dismissed them, pushed closer to the Yalu. Then, November 25, 1950, disaster. Around 300,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers poured across the border, attacking the UN forces.
A massive Chinese intervention changed the war again.
Completely. UN forces were overwhelmed, forced into a long, brutal retreat back south, below the 38th parallel again. The war settled into a bloody stalemate around that original dividing line. By early 1951, the front stabilized, UN forces counterattacked, pushed back near Seoul. Truman, by March 51, was ready to negotiate a peace settlement, basically restoring the pre-war border at the 38th parallel. A limited war, achieving the original goal of saving South Korea.
But MacArthur disagreed. Publicly.
Yes, and this led to the huge showdown. MacArthur wanted total victory. He openly criticized Truman's limited war strategy. He even issued his own set of peace demands to the Chinese and North Koreans, and worse, threatened to expand the war into China, possibly using nuclear weapons again. A direct challenge to the president's authority as commander-in-chief.
How did Truman respond to that insubordination?
He was furious. The source says an infuriated Truman dismissed the general on April 10, 1951. It wasn't just the disagreement on strategy, it was MacArthur undermining civilian control of the military and risking a much wider, potentially catastrophic war with China.
Firing MacArthur, a national hero, must have been incredibly unpopular.
Politically, it was dynamite. Huge backlash at home. But Truman stood firm on principle. Peace talks started in July 51, but they dragged on. Sporadic, bitter fighting continued along the 38th parallel for the rest of Truman's presidency. He also authorized more military aid to build up NATO in Europe, creating a long-term U.S. military presence there. So by the time he left office, the U.S. military was globally positioned for the long Cold War struggle.
Yet, despite shaping this post-war world order, creating NATO, fighting in Korea, his popularity at home remained terrible.
Rock bottom. By late 1951, his approval was down in the low 20s. He got very little public credit for the huge foreign policy shifts or the military buildup. And his administration was dogged by corruption scandals in its later years, not involving Truman personally, but people around him.
Like General Vaughn.
Yeah, Harry Vaughn was a main target. Old Army buddy from WWI, served as Truman's military aide. He admitted in 1951 to taking gifts, essentially bribes, in exchange for helping people get access to the president. Truman's view, according to the source, was that, well, his administration wasn't necessarily more corrupt than others, and he wasn't personally responsible.
But the source suggests his loyalty played a role.
Yes, this is a key point the source makes. Truman's intense loyalty, his unwillingness to abandon his friends, even when they embarrassed him or were implicated in wrongdoing, damaged his own reputation. It highlights how a personal virtue, loyalty, could become a political liability for him despite his own financial honesty.
Facing low polls in these scandals, he decides not to run again in 1952, even though he could have.
That's right. He was eligible under the old rules, having served less than 2 full terms, but he chose not to run. The Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson. The Republicans nominated the hugely popular war hero, Dwight Eisenhower. Ike attacked Truman's handling of the Korean War, promising to put it to an end.
And Eisenhower won.
Comfortably. 6 months after taking office, Eisenhower did oversee the signing of the armistice in Korea, July 1953. It ended the fighting, established the DMZ, but technically North and South Korea remain at war to this day.
So, Truman leaves office under a cloud, returns home. What was his retirement like?
He went back to Independence, Missouri, lived fairly modestly, especially compared to later ex-presidents. He immediately started working on his memoirs. They came out in 2 volumes in 1955, covering his presidency in detail. And he focused heavily on establishing his presidential library.
The Truman Library in Independence. He was very involved with it.
Incredibly involved. Construction finished in 57. And from then until about 1964, the source says he was the library's main attraction. He had an office there, worked there almost every day. He'd give impromptu tours to visitors, loved showing off his old army uniforms. He saw it as a serious place for studying the presidency, and he especially enjoyed talking to groups of school children.
Did he stay engaged in politics? Offer opinions?
Oh, absolutely. Kept a close eye on things. He wasn't impressed with Eisenhower, thought he was too influenced by big business, and he really disliked Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's VP, especially after Nixon had accused the Truman administration of being soft on communism.
What about JFK?
Initially, not a fan. Thought Kennedy was just a rich playboy riding his father's coattails in 1960. But once Kennedy won the nomination, the presidency, Truman supported him. He and Bess were invited back to the White House in 61. He was deeply shaken by Kennedy's assassination in 63.
And he saw some of his own domestic policy ideas come to fruition under Lyndon Johnson.
Yes, that was a significant moment for him. LBJ's Great Society programs, especially things like Medicare, really echoed Truman's own fair deal proposals from the late 40s, which had mostly been blocked by Congress back then. In a really symbolic act, LBJ traveled to the Truman Library in July 1965 to sign the Medicare bill into law, right there with Truman beside him. LBJ presented Truman with the very first Medicare card, card number 1.
A powerful moment of recognition for his earlier efforts.
A really nice capstone. His health started to fail more seriously after a bad fall in late 1964. He stopped going to the library regularly. He spent his last years quietly at home in Independence and passed away on December 26, 1972. He was 88.
And even his funeral arrangements had a touch of his personality.
They did. He was buried in the courtyard of his library after a state funeral. He'd approved the plans years before, and his reported comment on it. A damn fine show. I just hate that I'm not going to be around to see it. Classic Truman Blunt, right down to earth to the very end.
So looking back over this whole deep dive, drawing on the source material, his life was just an incredible arc, from that Missouri farm through all those failed businesses, navigating the murky world of machine politics, WWI captaincy, the Senate, then suddenly president, facing the end of a world war, the dawn of the nuclear age, the start of the Cold War.
The source really emphasizes just how unlikely his path was. How unprepared in many conventional ways he seemed for the sheer scale of what hit him. Yet somehow, this man became one of the pivotal figures of the 20th century, making decisions, the bomb, containment, NATO, Korea, that shaped the world we still live in.
And he remains, as the source acknowledges, deeply controversial. Those huge decisions came at immense human cost. For many people, his legacy is defined by the bomb, by the Cold War's beginnings, by the casualties in Korea. He's seen by some as, frankly, a villain.
And the source itself leaves us with some of those tough questions hanging in the air. Was he fundamentally an honest public servant who navigated a corrupt system as best he could? Or was he inevitably tainted by that Pendergast connection and maybe too loyal to flawed friends? Was the use of the atomic bombs ultimately justified, especially that second one, dropped so quickly? Could different choices have averted the Cold War, or maybe altered its course in Asia?
It makes you think. Considering where he started, that unassuming background, that winding, difficult path, and then the unprecedented power and pressure he faced. What does Harry Truman's story, as revealed in this source, tell you about leadership, about how ordinary people can rise to extraordinary moments, about the nature of power itself, and the truly impossible choices that sometimes land on one person's shoulders?
His life really is a study in how character gets forged in struggle, how navigating complex systems requires a certain, maybe uncomfortable pragmatism, and how history sometimes throws immense responsibility onto people who never sought it, whose resumes don't seem to fit the job description. He was complex, flawed, decisive, and operating on a world stage that must have seemed galaxies away from that farm in Lamar, Missouri.
We hope this deep dive into the source material has given you a richer, maybe more complicated understanding of Harry Truman, a truly fascinating and undeniably consequential figure.